Hey. May we welcome all of you to our class this morning. And to those who are online, we welcome you to our Bible class here at the Elmore Church of Christ. We're delighted that all of you are with us. And for those who are online, I would like to give you a personal invitation, if it is possible for you to be here, to come and be with us in the auditorium. I believe that you'll get more from the class if you're here, if you can hear the comments that are made. So we'd like to invite you, if you possibly can, to come to be with us in class. If you've not been coming to a Bible class on Sunday morning, it's a good time for you to get started. We'd be delighted to have you. Now, Scott has been up here fooling with my... There's no telling where I'll start. He may have it all backwards. You may be wondering why I'm up here teaching the class, and Scott will be sitting out here in the audience. Hopefully he'll be in here. Maybe a little background will help you understand the situation. Between 3 and 4 years ago, I suppose it was, I decided to study this problem of human suffering in depth. And so I began to read all the materials that I have in my files, and I found that I had more than 60 books and periodicals in my files dealing with the subject. So I began to read, and after I'd read about 60 of them, I began to think about this business of studying this subject in a class. And I thought about it, and I could not think of a time when I had ever taught this subject in a class like this. I had preached on virtually every aspect of human suffering, but I'd never taught on it in a class to combine it all at one time. And I tried to think about it. I couldn't think of another congregation that has done that. I had never been in a class in which the subject was discussed at length, and I have not found a congregation that had had a class on it as we're having now. Is there anyone in the audience who has ever taught this subject for a quarter in a class? No one. Have you ever been in a class in which someone taught the subject for a whole quarter? David and Brenda have, because they sat in my class over at Eastern Meadows. I forgot about that for a minute there. Have you ever heard of a class or a congregation anywhere that had a class on it? No one. It was the same with me. How can we explain that? With a subject so needed and so vital, why have we not had a class on it? We can do more teaching in a class on a subject for 45 minutes than we can 30 minutes in a sermon. I wonder why we have never had a class on it. I've not really been able to figure it out personally. But after I'd read all these books on it, studied about it a good bit, I was asking Steve Housley about it. Steve's a good friend of mine, preacher at Eastern Meadows for 35 years or so, and I'd preached in meetings there with him in the past and considered him a good friend. He'd know all about whatever had happened there. And I asked him, had you ever had a class here on this subject for a quarter? And he said, no. And I said, I'm almost persuaded to volunteer to teach a class on this subject, since we've never had one on it. David was working with us as the educational director at that time, and in a short while, he came to me. I knew I'd made a mistake when I told Steve I was almost persuaded to volunteer. David came to me and said, we'd like you to teach the auditorium class next quarter on the subject of the problem of human suffering. And I'd already put my foot in my mouth and couldn't very well say no. So I decided to do it. And I made preparation for it. I wrote down a lot of notes on what I'd read and studied and learned and what I'd thought and found in the past by personal experience. And I had 25 pages of typed notes to use for the class. And looking over it, I realized there was a suffering that I had overlooked. And I don't know to this day, really, how I'd overlooked it. It was the problem of suffering in poverty. People can suffer in poverty. I don't know how I ever overlooked it. But then as I thought about it, I realized that most of the books that I had read on the subject had not discussed poverty as a way of suffering. But it is really one of the primary ways in which many people suffer today. So I went back and prepared 2 more pages of notes. So I had 27 pages of notes to use for that class. I searched through all of my files, and I have many files. I have 3 4-drawer filing cabinets. Each drawer is about that deep, and all of them are filled. And I searched through my files for materials on this subject because I had never taught it, never heard anybody teach on it. So I had to do a lot of work and preparation in finding materials to use for this subject. And I found, I think, 27 file folders that I gathered out of my files to use on this subject. And I can just hear somebody suffering now will be by the time you get through with all of that. But there's a great deal of material on the subject, though we have not used it very much, it seems to me. Well, I taught that course at Eastern Meadows, and then Steve Housley, the preacher there, urged me strongly to write a book on it, put it in book form. I never thought about doing such a thing. I never thought that anything that I would do would be worthy of going into a book. And then if I remember correctly, David also urged me to write a book on this subject. I hope that means they saw something of it. I hope that it would be of you in struggling with human suffering. And I appreciated those compliments. Then the other day, Scott paid me a great compliment. He said, "Why don't you and I write a book on this subject?" Now, I appreciated that. Now, he'd have to do it if we did it. But I appreciated that. And I hope that the material will be of some value to you as you struggle with some of the problems of life. Now, that's where we are right now. We are beginning today. And I know there are going to be questions on this subject. I've been asked many times questions in this area. These other preachers have too. And I'd like to ask you to write down your question. If you have a question in this area, write it down. You don't have to sign it. You don't have to send it to me. Hand it to Scott or David or one of the elders, and they'll give it to me. I don't need to know who asked the question, but we want to try to answer the questions. Now, if I'm not able to answer a question, we've got Scott and David in here, and I know they can answer it. I have tremendous confidence in these 2 men and their knowledge and their scholarship, and they'll be able to answer any question that can be answered. I might point out the fact that there may be a question that I can't answer, and they may not be able to answer it either. Maybe some specific question you would have about your particular suffering, and we may not know the answer for you, at least to your satisfaction. Now, I can answer those questions to my satisfaction, but they may not be to your satisfaction. Go along and some questions like that. Now, I don't claim to be an expert in this field or in any other field. You know what an expert is, don't you? Look at that word, expert. The prefix X means you're a has-been. That might get me all right. You say, I'm an ex-ball player. That means you used to do it. And the word spurt means you're a big drip under pressure. So in that sense, I might be an expert, but I'm not an expert in knowing everything about this subject. So I mean to imply that. And the fact that I'm supposed to be teaching it does not mean that I know everything about it. I do not. But with these 2 brethren in here, we ought to be able to handle most of the questions that you might have. Now, seriously, there may be some questions that we might not be able to answer. My wife and I lost a little baby in infancy, and I don't know why. I can give some general principles from the Bible that explain why suffering is in the world, and we're going to be talking about it. We hope to be able to help you understand some reasons for suffering and why suffering is in the world. But I couldn't tell you specifically why our little baby died in infancy. Never did anything wrong, never sinned at all, and yet he died very early. And it may be that you have a question about some loved one of yours that you may not be able to answer. You might wonder why in the world did he or she die. we may not know here. Do you remember that song, Farther Along? It's in our songbook. I'm going to refer to this again later with some of the other words in it, but I want you to listen to the words in the chorus. Farther along, we'll know all about it. Farther along, we'll understand why. Cheer up, my brother. Live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by. Will we? You know, I don't know of a scripture personally that tells us that we'll be able to sit down with God and ask Him these questions and find the answer to them. Now, we assume that we can, and I believe that we will be able to, but I don't know of a scripture that specifically says you can sit down and ask God questions that you haven't answered here, and He'll answer it for you. Now, I believe that we'll be able to do that. I think there's a scripture that indicates a reason for these things. Revelation 21 and verse 4. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. There shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. If we can understand why we won't have any pain anymore, any sorrow, that'll help us to understand why we had some of these problems here on earth. They may help prepare us for heaven. That may be the best we can do right now. We may not understand exactly why something has happened, but we can understand that these sufferings that we experience here can prepare us for heaven. So, let me at this point ask you if you have anything you'd like to say at this point, any comments or any questions you'd like to ask here in the beginning. If you have questions, please write them down. Don't come by the door later and ask me a question. I may forget it. I have a good forgetter. But you need to write it down and give it to me, and we'll try to answer it when we come to it in proper context. I believe we need to teach on this subject. I believe that every member of the church needs to study this matter, because there are members of the church whose faith has been weakened because of problems in this area. And we need to fortify their faith. We need to help them to understand as best we can why we are suffering here on earth. And so we need to teach it. Not just those in this class now. We need to teach the whole congregation. Every member of the church needs to study this matter. Now, I'd like to give you a little picture of what we plan to do this quarter. What do you consider to be the greatest threat to our faith? If I ask you individually, I would imagine the most you would say it's problems having to do with suffering. That challenges our faith more than most any other thing. Atheists and infidels believe they have the argument that we cannot answer. Infidels believe that there is no God. If there were a God, if He's a God of love and power and wisdom and all of that, then we wouldn't have the suffering that we have on earth. And they think we can't answer that. I believe that we can. And that's probably the greatest threat to our faith, especially for those of us who are members of the church who have faith. So I think there's a need for us to study it. I want to give you an overall view of what we're going to be studying this quarter. We want to talk about the size of the problem. As I studied it, I began to see that it's a big problem. It's a wide, broad subject to be covered. And I think we can say that everybody suffers. I don't believe I've ever met anyone who did not suffer in some way. Everyone suffers. I'm reminded of that story that made the rounds in church bulletins some years ago about Chippy the Parakeet. If you remember hearing this, please don't stop me. I'm going to tell it again. It illustrates our point. There was a lady who had a little parakeet who seemed to be happy. That parakeet was always chirping and singing. One day she was vacuuming her house, and she was using one of these vacuums that sat on the floor, canister, with a long hose and an attachment on the end of it, and she was vacuuming. And she thought it'd be a good time to clean the floor of her bird cage. So she took the attachment off the end of it and stuck that hose up in the bird cage. Chippy was perched up here on a swing, and she was vacuuming his floor. and she thought she heard the phone ring. Holding her hose up there, she looked around to see where her phone was, and all of a sudden she heard, and she looked around and Chippy was gone. And she thought she had sucked him up in that vacuum cleaner. She turned it off, opened up the top, grabbed that bag that catches all the dust and dirt and debris inside, and tore it open, and there was Chippy, blinking his eyes, scared looking, dusty and dirty and deep debris all over him. And she thought she'd better clean him up. So she went into the bathroom, turned the faucet on full blast, and stuck him under that water, almost drowned him. And when she got through and turned the water off, he looked like a pile of little wet feathers. And she thought, well, I better dry him off. So she got the hair dryer, turned it on full blast, and she had to hold him or it'd blow him away. And she dried him off. And that story made the rounds, and a reporter for the paper thought it'd make a good human interest story. So he went out to see this lady and asked her, how is Chippy doing now? She said, well, Chippy doesn't sing much anymore. He just sits and stares. Now, we can identify with Chippy. Oftentimes, we feel like life has sucked us up, thrown cold water on us, and has blown us away. The heartaches and sorrows that we experience can make us feel very much like Chippy. Everyone suffers. That's why we need to study the subject. Do you remember Norman Vincent Peale? Those of you young folks here probably don't remember him, but you're from the Pepsi generation. But those of us from the Deer Call for Lunch bunch. No. He was a preacher for a denominational church in New York City, but that's not why he's so well known, really. He became a great speaker to pump people up, encourage people. And businesses all over America invited him to come to speak to their employees because he was a great motivational speaker. He had a lot of good things to say. You'd do well to read some of his writings. And he said on one occasion, the only people who don't suffer or have any troubles in life are those in the graves. And some of them have some real troubles. That's a pretty wise statement. There's no one who has no troubles except those in the grave, and some of them have some real troubles. It is a widespread problem. Have you ever peeled an onion? Did it make you cry? I really haven't had that experience. I'm a Christian. I don't eat onions. Don't fool with them at all, you know. So I haven't peeled an onion. But I'm told that when you peel that thing, it can make the tears come. Life is like that. You can peel it off one layer at a time, and sometimes you weep. That's the way life is. There are heartaches and sorrows for everyone. No one is exempt from it. So there's a need for us to study the problem and see if there's something that can help us to struggle with these things, something that will fortify our faith and keep us from giving up our faith and becoming weaker because some problem comes to us in life. Why is there suffering in the world? That's going to be a large part of our study, especially here as we lay a foundation. We're going to lay a foundation here in the beginning and then build on that foundation. And we'll need to start with that question. The one word that people ask more often than any other when they suffer is why. Isn't that right? Why? Why did this happen to me? Well, we're going to go to the Bible and find some answers to that, I think. And if you were going to the Bible to read in one book, to learn as much as you can about suffering, what book would you go to? Book of Job? That's it. The book of Job deals with suffering. I might tell you in the beginning, the book of Job does not answer every question that you'll have. It answers some questions. It can help us to really understand some important matters about suffering. But it will not answer every question. But we're going to have occasion to refer to the book of Job a number of times as we study together this quarter. Why do bad things happen to good people? That's the way it's usually asked, isn't it? Why do bad things happen to good people? The other side of the coin is just as perplexing. Why do good things happen to bad people? Have you thought about it in that way? You look around you and you see some people who are reprobates, and they seem to be prospering, seem to be doing well in life. They don't seem to be suffering as we are. And you wonder, why do good things happen to bad people? We want to talk about that as well. There is a third way in which to ask why, that maybe we haven't thought about it, but I hope this will come through as we study together this quarter. Why am I blessed as I am? Do you ever stop to think about that? Why did God bless me so much? Instead of thinking about why do bad things happen to me, we need to think about the good things and be thankful to God for the good things that have happened to us. I hope that will come through this quarter. And if we learn that very lesson, it'll help us to be strengthened against the problems and sorrows and heartaches of life. Then I want us to talk about some general areas of suffering. Now, I see three areas. Let me mention them, and you can tell me if I've overlooked some general area. The general areas. There are many specific areas of suffering under that. The first is physical suffering. People suffer physically. You're familiar with that. Heart attacks, cancer, COVID-19. There are many ways in which we can suffer physically. And then second, mental and emotional suffering. People can suffer in that area. And their suffering may be almost as bad as cancer and some other ways in which you suffer physically. And so physically, mentally and emotionally, and then third, spiritually. There is spiritual suffering. And I might add that sometimes there will be an overlapment. That is, you may suffer spiritually, but it may show up in physical suffering too. A person may become involved in immorality, may develop AIDS. And I don't mean to imply that every person who has AIDS has suffered because of his sins. There are people who suffer with AIDS who haven't sinned that way. Or you may have a diseased liver because of drinking alcohol, or cancer of the lung because you smoke. And so there may be a spiritual problem, but it may show up also in the physical area. And it may show up in the mental or emotional area. There are people who have sinned, and then they suffer with guilt. I have counseled with people who were just eaten up with guilt because of some sin they'd committed. I remember one woman who had committed the sin 30 years before and was still suffering guilt because of it. So those are the three general areas that we will talk about. Have I overlooked any general area? Don't see anyone raising a hand. All right. We want to talk about general areas, and we want to get specific. We want to talk about specific areas of suffering. And we will want to offer some suggestions in regard to these areas of suffering. Hopefully, suggestions that will help us to cope with them and overcome them and maintain our faith in God. And then we want to talk about the question, what to do when the walls cave in on you. Now, this will be a summation of suggestions we've made through the quarter, and we like to put them together and suggest at the end of the quarter some things that we can do that will enable us to live triumphant lives even though we've suffered in some way in life. Do you know how to sleep when the wind blows? When the storm comes? Not too long ago, we had some storms in this area. And one night, when we went to bed, we were hearing on the news that bad weather's coming in, and get in your closet or in some lower place and this and that. If you hear that it's upon you, well, I consider that, and I went to bed as normal, went to sleep. Didn't worry about it. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could do that about life? When the storms of life come, and the wind blows heavily upon you, and your heart is broken, wouldn't it be good to be able to sleep when the storms of life come. And I hope that we'll be able to make some suggestions this quarter that will enable us to do that. The winds can blow, but we'll stand. The walls may fall in, but we'll stand. Because our hope is anchored in Christ. Christ, who is our hope. And that's the main foundation that we need to build. Faith in God. Trust in Him. Live for Him. And then we can stand through those storms of life. Well, I would like to be like this preacher who was asked about his philosophy of preaching a sermon. He was asked, how do you preach a sermon? What's your philosophy about developing a sermon? He said, well, number one, I tell them what I'm going to tell them. Number two, I tell them. And then number three, I tell them what I've already told them. You may find that this series of lessons partakes of that philosophy somewhat. So we're trying to tell you now what we hope to talk about. Then I'm going to tell you. And then we want to draw it to a conclusion and make some suggestions to help you stand through the trials of life. As we get along in this series, I hope to be able to present a lesson on help for hurting parents. One of the ways in which people are suffering is in our relationship with our children, and the fact that sometimes our children have gone astray. They're not living for Christ, not living as we want them to live, and we're suffering because of it. There are a lot of members of the church who are suffering for that very reason. And I'd like to present a lesson entitled, Help for Hurting Parents. And I hope that that will help you with some of the suffering that you may be experiencing. Well, these are some of the things that we want to talk about this quarter. And I want to stop at this point and see if you have anything you'd like to say, any questions you want to ask, or something you'd like to make sure we talk about this quarter. As you think about it, please write it down and get it to me in some way, and we'll consider it. Buckle your seatbelts now. We're about to take off. We'd like to think for just a few moments about the size of the problem. I've mentioned that we want to talk about the size of the problem, the broadness, the breadth of this problem. It is a wide problem. How many people have said at some time in their life, why has this happened to me? Why did God allow this to happen to me? It is a question that is widely asked, and we need to have some answers for it. And we need to study to see what God has said about it. And that's one of the reasons that causes me to wonder why we haven't done more teaching on it. Why have we not had a class that deals specifically and in depth about this problem of human suffering? Well, the problem with most of us is that we want to have all paved roads and level sidewalks, don't we? That's the way we want life to be. But it isn't that way. Out in the physical world, all the roads are not paved. You know that. One of the roughest roads I've ever been on, I think the roughest, was on a road going up into the Ural Mountains in Russia. We'd made friends with some young Russians there in Etal, Russia, and I went back time after time working with the church there. And some of these young Russians, who are not Christians, became friends of ours, and they wanted to take me up into the Ural Mountains. That's the mountains that separate Russia from Siberia. And so they took the translator and me up in the mountains, had a picnic up there. And riding up there, up that road, it was up and down, over ditches and rocks and this and that. I've never seen a road like that. We have roads here in America, though, that are not paved. They're clay roads or gravel roads. If you're down in Florida, you have some sand roads. But we want our roads to be paved in life, don't we? But that's not reality. We want our sidewalks to be level, but that's not reality. Have you ever stumbled over a sidewalk? Sidewalks are often put down in sections like that. And if there's an oak tree nearby, the roots can go under that thing, and as it grows up as well as out that way, and it lifts one of those sections. And you can come along there not noticing that and trip over that thing. There are roads that are not paved. There are sidewalks that are not level. And we need to understand that that's the way it is in life. There are some bumpy roads in our journey. And we stumble sometimes over some of these problems. But people wonder why. Why do we have that suffering? There's no way this can be a simple answer. The question is not a simple question. And as I indicated a while ago, there may be a question that you have that we may not be able to answer to your satisfaction. You may not be able to get an answer to it until you get to heaven. But we're going to do our best to try to find answers to these problems as we try to lay a foundation based upon faith in God. There's no complete answer to it for everybody. No total understanding of it for everybody. Even though you're a strong, faithful Christian, there may be some times when you wonder about some of the things that happen and wonder why that happened to you. If we can understand something of the size, the breadth of this problem, and that it affects everybody, it might help us to adjust and to live with it. So I want you to know that if you're suffering in some way, you're not alone. You're not the only one who suffers. And God is concerned, and He wants you to find peace and comfort in life. Well, suffering comes in different sizes. You know, you can go to the department store to buy some clothes, and you can find different sizes. There are a lot more sizes now than there used to be. At least it's broken down more. You used to go to a store and you can find a small, medium, and large. But now you can go and find a different size or two in small sizes, petite and whatever. You can get up to large, and then it can be extra large, and maybe some bigger ones than that. There are different sizes. Well, there are two sizes in suffering: large and extra large. I doubt that anyone would say my suffering personally is little, is small. Other people may look at your particular suffering, and they may say, well, that's just a little thing. To us, it may be little. But to the individual who's suffering, it's not a little. It's a big problem. So suffering comes in two sizes: large and extra large. Well, as we think about the size of suffering and how broad it is, you begin to think about how long it's been here. How long has suffering been here on earth? Ever since the beginning of Adam and Eve. In Genesis chapters 1 through 3, you remember that God created man. Then He created woman because He saw that it was not good that man should be alone. One little boy was describing that and said, God created man, looked at him and said, I can do better than that. And then He created woman. That's a pretty good way to look at it, isn't it? And God told Adam, you may eat of any tree of the garden but one. Of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. In chapter 3 we read that the devil came to Eve in the form of a serpent and tempted her to eat of that tree. She ate of it. She gave to Adam and he ate of it. And then what happened? Suffering came into the world. Death came into the world. God has said, in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. They separate themselves from God. Sin separates one from God. And sin brought suffering into the world. It brought death into the world, and death involves suffering. Suffering and death came into the world. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 16, we read, unto the woman, He said, and I know you're familiar with all this, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. So woman suffered some as a result of sin. And unto Adam He said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake. I believe that the ground itself, the earth, was affected by the sin as well. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. Man has to earn his bread by the sweat of his brow. I know there are people who say, well, preachers don't earn their bread by the sweat of the brow. They earn their bread by the sweat of the tongue, though. They work hard. Suffering came into the world along with death because of sin. Now, we can stop right there and we can say sin brought forth suffering in the world. But now we're going to become more specific and talk about some ways in which we can bring suffering upon ourselves or upon others. And then some of it comes upon us when we have nothing on earth to do with it. So we'll want to talk about that as we go along. Well, you see why suffering came in the beginning. Death came in the beginning because of sin. Suffering came along with that death. And as we go through life, if we remember, when we see suffering, we can look back at Adam and Eve and the sin they committed, and we can see why why suffering is in the world. Now, many Bible believers believe that the book of Job was the first Bible book written. It may well be. I can't really tell you. But there's something in the book that indicates that the story that's told there happened back in the first period of Bible history. Can somebody tell me what that is? What does it say in the book that indicates that? Job offered sacrifices for his children. That's the way they did it back in the patriarchal age. And so we read that he offered sacrifices for them. And so the book of Job, dealing with suffering, goes back to the first period of Bible history. You can go all the way back to Adam and Eve and begin to learn something about suffering. Well, we've indicated we want to think about its size, the broadness of it, the breadth of it, how big it is. The sin problem is the second most widespread problem that man has. The sin problem is the number one problem, the most widespread problem. The Bible tells us in Romans 3 and verse 10, there is none righteous, no, not one. And verse 23 says, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Now that pretty well gets everybody, doesn't it? Everyone has sinned. John tells us in 1 John 5 verse 19, the whole world lieth in wickedness. And so sin is in the world. Everyone has sinned if he's accountable. And so when you think about the size of it, your mind goes all the way back to the beginning. As ever since man has been on earth. It doesn't leave anyone out. Sometimes people make wrong application of some things they've read in the Bible. They know the Bible says certain things, but they make some wrong applications of it. There are some who say that God has caused all the sufferings that people have, and there's a reason for it. Have you heard someone say something like this? Well, everything happens for a reason. I don't believe that. I don't believe the Bible teaches that. You hear that sometimes from athletes. They tear the ACL in their knee, and they have to have surgery, and it takes a year to ever get back to normal. And I've read some statements some of these players have made. They said, well, everything happens for a reason. I'm just waiting to see what God has in mind for me. I don't believe the Bible teaches that God has determined that you're going to get hurt on this occasion. I don't believe the Bible teaches it. Some go so far as to say God has determined when you're going to die. I don't believe it does that. I'm aware of the fact that in Ecclesiastes 3, in the first few verses, the Bible tells us there's a certain time for this and that and the other, and it says, a time to be born, a time to die. But I don't believe that means that God has set a time for you to die, and you can't change that. I don't believe the Bible teaches that. I remember the story of a man who was talking to a friend about flying in an airplane, and this man said, well, I'm not going up in a plane. That thing may crash and I may die. And his friend said, well, if it's not your turn to die, you're not going to die. This man said, suppose we get up there in the air and this pilot's time to die. What's going to happen then? God has not set a time for each one to die, so far as I can tell in the Bible. That passage in Ecclesiastes 3 tells us there's a time for all of these things. They're going to happen. But I don't believe that God has set a time for you to die. Suppose God sets a time for you to die, and you put a .357 Magnum to your ear and pull the trigger. That'll clean your ear out, I'll tell you. Now, you can determine when you're going to die. I don't believe the Bible teaches that God has a set time for you to die, and you can't change it. If God has set a set time for you to die, why do you take medicine? Why pay so much money for all this medicine? You can take it and you live. If you don't take it, you can die. You can determine that. So you see, you have a decision in the matter. Have you ever been found to have cancer? Why do you go to the hospital and have it removed? If God has set a certain time for you to die, that cancer may be the thing that's supposed to do it. But suppose you go to the hospital, have it removed, and you live. You see, that idea doesn't fit in with what the Bible teaches. We have choices to make. We can determine what we do. And sometimes I can determine whether we live or die. Well, we can think about a lot of things about suffering and try to determine exactly why it happens, but we'll always go back to the beginning, and we can say, sin brought suffering into the world. Well, think about the seriousness of it. I think the second most serious thing the man faces is suffering. The first thing, most serious thing, is sin. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. That's a very serious matter. Romans 6:23 says, for the wages of sin is death. There's the result of sin. Wages of sin is death. In John 8, verse 21, Jesus said, I go my way, and ye shall seek me, and shall not find me. And whither I go, ye cannot come. Sin can keep us from going to be with God. That's how serious sin is. But can suffering have anything to do with our preparation to meet God? It can. If it shatters your faith, if it causes you to lose your faith in God, you won't have much interest in trying to prepare for eternity if you're hurting right now. Suffering can affect one's preparation for eternity. That's why we need to learn as much as we can about it and how to deal with it and cope with it, and not allow it to shake our faith in God. Well, suffering is one of the most serious things that we encounter because it affects what we do about our relationship with God. Sometimes we just turn our backs upon it. But then think about the frustration of it. I want to spend a little more time on this. Our time's about up. We just introduced it. Then I want to think about it, talk with you about it next week. Think about the frustration involved in suffering and in sin. It's the second most frustrating problem we face. People become involved in sin and they get all wrapped up in being drunkards or drug addicts or whatever, and it's frustrating. I've dealt with some who wanted to quit, who wanted to give it up, but they were so frustrated because they didn't have the strength to give it up. The same thing happens with suffering. Sometimes we suffer and we don't seem to be able to do anything about it. Think of Job. We said we're going to refer to him. Now, you know the story, so we're just going to hit some high points so you can know what we're saying. You remember that Job was a rich man. Sometimes at that time, their wealth was measured by how many cattle and animals they had. He had a lot of them. If I've counted correctly, he had about 4,000 animals. Lost all of them. The enemy came and took them. He lost his servants. He He couldn't do a thing in the world about those lost animals. He felt frustrated, no doubt. When his servants were killed, lost his servants, he couldn't do a thing in the world about it. Suppose you were in his shape. What would you have done about the fact that you lost your cattle, camels, and all those animals, and you lost your servants? It's a frustrating thing. He had children. How many did he have? 10. Lost all of them in one swoop. They were having a party there at the home of the oldest child, and a cyclone or tornado, something of that nature, hit that thing and killed all 10 of them at one time. And he couldn't do a thing in the world about it. Think how frustrating it was for him. And then he was afflicted with boils from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. He suffered. Couldn't do a thing in the world about it. He couldn't take pills or have a shingle shot or anything else to prevent it. It was frustrating. And so we want to think about the frustrations involved in sin and in suffering. We'll pick up there the next time. Let me ask you to bring that handout back, because we're not through with it, and we'll go into another one as well. Good to have all of you today.